Thank you very much, Stuart. And yes, apologies to everyone for the growth pains with the new version of Zoom. We were planning to do a little poll, but we will move to Plan B. So thank you very much, Stuart, for the introduction. It is wonderful to be here. I really appreciate you all spending your breakfast with me. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll all feel a little bit more comfortable with integrating generative AI into your lesson plans and classrooms. So I would like to start off with an acknowledgement of country as well. I am presenting to you today on Macquarie's Wadamagal campus, which is on Darug country. And I'd also like to recognise the long, rich history of oral tradition, the Indigenous way of passing down wisdom to younger generations and future generations. It is a practice that has happened on this country for thousands of years. We have the oldest living culture in the world. And so I would just like to reflect on the way in which teaching face-to-face, passing down oral tradition is relational, place-based, and of course carries with it intergenerational equity and responsibility. All right, so with the Plan B version of this temperature check, if you have access to a device where you're able to just do a thumbs up reaction, please do a thumbs up if you are finding yourself as someone that is very comfortable with integrating generative AI, regularly conducts lessons that involve generative AI, just so that I can gain a sense of whether we are at the beginning stages of using generative AI or if we're all kind of experts in the field. So if you're feeling on the more comfortable end, feel free to do a thumbs up now. Okay, beautiful. So I am very happy to speak to the very beginning phases of the different platforms that are available, their pros and cons, all of, yeah, thumbs down. That makes sense. Do a thumbs down if you're uncomfortable with AI. That's really, really good to know. So please feel free to share any questions in the Q&A regarding the basics. And I'll just, yeah, work on the assumed knowledge that we're all kind of beginners in this space. That's wonderful. That's a beautiful place to start. So, first and foremost, I'd like to take you all to a really dark place. And if you had the pleasure of teaching during the pandemic, this dark place will be very familiar to you. It is a Zoom
Oh
call
God,
where,
yeah.
oh, sorry, Lorraine. It is a Zoom call where the teacher is trying to be animated and alert, but they are teaching into a void of black screens where students are engaging in tutorials with their cameras off. So the question that remains in this kind of environment is, are students actually engaged? There is no more stark realization of your teaching practice than an online classroom where you're potentially speaking to no one for an hour. I had the pleasure of starting my teaching career during the pandemic, and so student engagement was always really front of mind to me. After conducting a bit of research, there are a lot of factors that influence whether students have their cameras on. Of course, engagement is only one of them. Some students simply feel uncomfortable, embarrassed about what's in the background of their frame. Some of them are multitasking and on the go while conducting tutorials. So, of course, there are a range of factors why those cameras were off, but one of them is certainly engagement. And so this idea of fostering student engagement was really front of mind, and it led me to ask this very uncomfortable question. So I'm now giving you all the benefit of also sitting uncomfortably with me in this question. What would happen if we no longer recorded student attendance? Of course, a lot of universities around Australia and indeed the world either mandate student attendance or encourage it through graded participation or at least record student attendance. So in some way or another, most students in tertiary education are being motivated to attend simply because they know it will affect their grades. So what do you think would happen if we no longer recorded student attendance? Do you think you would see a 50% drop in attendance rates? Do you think you would only have 5% of students turn up to class? Would no students turn up to class? Could you go home early if no students turned up to class? That is the question that I sat with after delivering my very first tutorials very nervously on Zoom a few years ago. And what I found when I started to really unpack this question and research different models that were out there that tried to motivate students to attend without simply grading it, I found that a lot of studies emphatically demonstrate that there is a very weak positive correlation between greater attendance and higher marks. So my concern does not lie with our wonderful students who are high achievers, highly motivated, actually doing all of their readings and watching the lectures every week, turning up to tutorials prepared and ready to engage in content. My focus is on that substantial pool of students who are engaging very minimally throughout the semester in their units and turning up to class merely as a performative theatrical display of masking that they are participating and engaged, but simply just turning up so that their name can get marked off. That was the question that I really wanted to kind of answer. And so all of my teaching practice is modeled on this group of students that I'm really concerned about. So there are three main challenges that I tried to solve when developing my pedagogy. The first is that in law school and indeed a lot of the units in the Faculty of Arts and even beyond in business schools and the like, tutors only have about 13 hours in any given semester to influence students to make wise use of the remaining time in the semester. So at Macquarie, we have a 13-week semester twice a year. That means that I have, and I did run the maths on this, it's quite terrifying. I have just 13 hours per semester to influence my law students to make wise use of the remaining 2,171 hours. So I called this the 99.4% problem to demonstrate the stark disparity between the hours in which I am actually with my students, engaging them in course content versus all of the time they have for eating, sleeping, working, and frankly, facing a lot of distractions outside of their course study. So if all my students have to do to get that tick of attendance is turn up for 13 hours in a semester and pretend that they're engaging with course content, that makes me very, very worried about the meaningful level of engagement that they're getting. Especially in the age of AI, I remember when I had to spend hours reading the textbook, listening to the lectures in order to answer pre-prepared answers to the tutorial questions. Students can now just copy and paste the 5 or 6 tutorial questions that we, give them in preparation for their tutorials, pop it into ChatGPT, it spits out answers immediately. They copy and paste it into their notes, hardly even reading over it. And then in class, I ask them the question and they read off their computer and provide me the AI-generated response. That is not deep engagement with course content. I'm sure we're all on the same page there. And so this problem is only getting worse when bots can simply replace that deep engagement. The second constraint alongside this temporal constraint is a spatial challenge, and it's the fact that most of us deliver our tutorials within 4 white walls. This risks reducing tutorials to transactional exchanges. Again, this kind of performative role of I ask questions, students answer them, but it feels incredibly detached from the real world. So I wanted to bring real world context into my tutorials so that hopefully my students are transcended beyond the archetypal classroom. And that's a really wonderful opportunity for generative AI, which I'll explain in a moment. The third and final challenge that I wanted to overcome was course content. I like to really challenge myself in my role here at Macquarie Law School, and so I purposefully teach subjects that I know students find very conceptually tough and generally don't enjoy engaging in, subjects like constitutional law. Um, I like to teach those units because it really presents the challenge of course content. I cannot change the legal principles and the cases that I teach my students, but I can change how I teach them. So the pedagogy surrounding the delivery of that course content is really, really key. That's where we have power as tutors. And so that was the third and final problem that I wanted to solve. So what was I up against? When I first became an academic, the Langdellian Socratic pedagogy was incredibly prevalent and still is to this day. It is the simple question and answer Socratic style of teaching where you engage in discussions in class by simply asking questions that students answer. Now, I've just highlighted before that in the age of AI, this style of teaching is becoming less effective at engaging students in thinking because they simply get ChatGPT to do the work for them. So I really want to engage my students in higher orders of thinking. That means that I don't just want them to explain the law, I want them to apply it, evaluate it in a whole range of contemporary contexts, and therefore critically and independently think for themselves, is the law functioning well, and how could we improve it? That is a much higher order of thinking than simply spitting out some facts from case law. So I read some papers that basically said, let's bury the Langdellian kind of method of teaching. It was developed at Harvard Law School in the late 1800s. It's time to move with the times. And so generative AI offered me that opportunity to evolve the pedagogy to something far more engaging. So where I landed is adopting the more Vygotskian method of teaching. This is recognizing learning as participation. I think David Kolb puts it beautifully when he says people learn best through experience. So how can I turn the classroom from a Socratic question and answer style of pedagogy to a learning experience where students are participating in real world contexts, so that they're not just understanding the law, but applying it and critiquing it. So it's a form of experiential learning where they don't know the answer at the beginning of the tutorial. They certainly can't find it by simply putting it into ChatGPT, because I deliver, and I'll explain this in a moment, I deliver activities where they do not come pre-prepared. They have to work collaboratively to find the answer. They have to experiment with the course content, research, evaluate, debate with their peers, to therefore arrive at a contribution, which they deliver at the end of the tutorial. So the methodology is that kind of experiential, simulated learning based on the social construction of learning as participation. So let's get into what that actual practical pedagogy is and what it looks like in my tutorials. In the age of generative AI, I have just highlighted all of the limitations and problems that arise with students having access to generative AI. But it poses a little bit of a paradox because I'm also going to now say how generative AI can be the solution in very controlled ways in which educators are using it for all of its wonderful benefits. So there is no world in which we can stop our students from using generative AI. And of course, if you are someone that has the pleasure of marking hundreds of papers a semester like I do, you will know that it is incredibly prevalent and not being used very well when it comes to writing essays, for example. So how can we actually use AI in a way that is productive and benefits students' learning? I argue that that requires teachers and educators to get comfortable with AI and using it in controlled environments like the classroom. So, of course, what students do outside of the classroom is beyond our control, but actually teaching students to engage with it in productive manners in tutorials, that's really where I want to focus my attention. I'd love to acknowledge Dr. Amanda Head and Dr. Brian Balson-Stanton for their incredible work in developing AI platforms that students can actually engage with in tutorials. We've been working hard on developing these platforms for a number of years, but it is time intensive. It can be very resource intensive unless you have a tech whiz like Brian who knows how to do coding in very cost-effective manners. But I didn't want to focus today on those kind of more long-term, arduous means of adopting generative AI. I'm sure a lot of institutions around Australia are developing ways to really integrate generative AI into the classroom. But fortunately, for your purposes today, I'm going to demonstrate a much more time-effective and cost-effective means of integrating generative AI into the classroom. So my methodology does not involve students sitting on their laptop engaging with AI during tutorials. It is much more it's delivered through my actual teaching practice. And so all of the interactions with generative AI are done when I am actually developing the course materials prior to the classroom. So what does that look like? This method of teaching is very, very simple. I am a law academic, so my tutorials are 1 hour. I first and foremost introduce the key concepts to students for that week. So I'll pick 2 or 3 critical concepts that I need them to walk away with, assuming that they've had a busy week and haven't had any time to actually engage in the materials. So we're all on the same page with the very few concepts that I introduce at the start of the tutorial. I then situate those concepts in a real world context. So I explain how they apply in the real world. Hopefully I have a few interesting stats or figures up my sleeve, perhaps a short YouTube video, just to help situate those concepts. The third and most important thing for our purposes today in this breakfast series is the simulated scenario that I then give to students. So I could say in about 20 minutes of preparing for my tutorials, I can open up a generative AI platform, potentially ChatGPT or Copilot. I can ask it to deliver a 150 to 200 word scenario based on the key concepts that I would like students to learn that week. I then ask ChatGPT or Copilot, for example, to allocate different roles to students so that each table is engaging in a slightly different way to the others in solving this scenario. So I will, in a moment, show you a few examples of these simulated scenarios, but first and foremost, I will just demonstrate their benefits. So it's a simple PowerPoint presentation. I take the 150 to 200 word simulated scenario that the generative AI has provided me with. I will typically ask it to produce a few different versions, a few different examples, so I can pick and choose which one I like. In a matter of seconds, these incredibly engaging, tangible scenarios are created, saving me as a tutor plenty of time before delivering my tutorials, which is fantastic. So I choose the best one, and then I simply put that text onto my PowerPoint slide. So there is no high risk generative AI engagement during tutorials. It's simply helping me create those simulated scenarios without all of the workload. So, of course, the benefit of generative AI in this context is that its language is very eloquent, very engaging, something that would certainly take me hours if I were to do it from scratch. So this version of using AI is incredibly scalable, and I implore you to integrate these kind of simulated activities into all of your future tutorials. It's an incredibly collaborative way collaborative and interesting way to deliver course content. So once I started doing this about 2 to 3 years ago, I started engaging in surveys with my students to just test how this was being perceived. What was the feedback from students? The biggest benefit that I see for these types of hypothetical simulated scenarios as very active exercises in tutorials. The main benefit is that students feel like they are engaging in really active learning. So out of 127 students that I surveyed, 100% of them agreed that with these simulated scenarios, they were being engaged in active learning. And the benefit of that, the biggest benefit in my eyes, is that it transitions us from knowledge acquisition to skills development. In the age of AI, information is everywhere. Information is no longer valuable, and knowledge is losing its value as well. So I really want to focus my attention as a tutor in tutorials on skills development. This is very true for the legal discipline, and I'm sure in other disciplines as well. We are seeing graduates being replaced by AI. It is simply the case that the junior roles after graduation are something that AI can do. Maybe not completely accurately or very well, but it can at least take away some of those more menial, repetitious, arduous tasks, time-consuming tasks. And so what I argue is that we really need to emphasize skills development. Whilst AI can, say, in a legal context, engage in discovery, it cannot negotiate with clients, interview clients, deliver submissions in court. And so in my eyes, skills development is becoming so much more important. So with these active learning exercises, I am encouraging students to not just understand the legal concepts, but actually engage in a certain skill set. So these are role-based scenarios, which I'll explain in a moment with the examples that I have. So if I have a scenario where, say, I am simulating a UN summit, I will then ask ChatGPT or Copilot to allocate a certain role to each group. That role will hopefully relate to something that is relevant for their future careers. So one week, a table might be asked to act as UN diplomats for Australia. Another week, they might be an EPA license approval personnel. Perhaps another week, they're a judge. Another week, they're a police officer. Another week, they're a lawyer. Each week, they're engaging in different roles that really bring real-world context to the classroom. This not only makes content more relevant, but what I've found is that it also allows students to see themselves as future professionals. They feel really inspired by personifying these roles, even if they have no interest in pursuing a career in, say, being a judge or a police officer in the future. What it does is it just allows them to imagine a world beyond university. I joke with my students at the start of the semester that I imagine they're not dedicating 3 to 5 years of their life and racking up, say, $50,000 to $70,000 worth of HECS debt just as a hobby. You know, they're doing their law degree so that they can get a job, so that they can be employed after. And so what I found with the Langdellian Socratic method of teaching is that it separates students from their futures. They just don't see the link between the content that they're learning, how it's relevant for their future careers, and how they could have a career in it. So I've had students tell me that they've wanted to pursue a career in some of the roles that they've been allocated in tutorials because it was a job that they just never imagined and saw for themselves. So one simple, 1 hour tutorial can sometimes influence the entire future careers of my students, which has been a wonderful, wonderful impact to see the way that role playing can just foster career development. So out of 367 students that I surveyed, they all reported very high levels of engagement and motivation because they are seeing themselves as future professionals in my classrooms. I also found when I did a bit of research on this idea of role-based scenarios for career development, that this is a much stronger predictor of graduate success than prior achievement at school. So you can take a student who is not your kind of archetypal A grade student, place them into a context where they are in a role that they're inspired by and see themselves, potentially being in the future. And it just really fosters high levels of engagement and motivation, which hopefully then leads to better engagement with course content and, of course, better marks as a result. What I found interesting beyond the role-based benefits and the career development benefits was the fact that these kind of scenarios also allow for a really judgment-free collaborative learning space. This is something that I never actually thought about when I started scaling up these generative AI scenarios. It was only when I received 256 student nominations for the Students' Choice Award at Macquarie University, which was overwhelming and beautiful. It was only when I started reading through them that I understood this idea of judgment-free collaborative learning spaces. So it was quite a long period of time to read through 256 reasons why my students liked my teaching. I cried a lot. There were a lot of tissues, but it was the most overwhelming and incredible feedback as to why this teaching practice works. And so one of my students, nomination number 35, said, and I'll just kind of quote this down here, she's incredibly encouraging and allows each student to discuss course content without judgment. This idea of judgment came up so many times in these nominations, and it allowed me to reflect back to when I was a law student. When classrooms were simply Socratic teaching methods of question answer, there was no collaboration. Our classrooms were set up with 4 rows of seating. None of us spoke to each other. I was incredibly nervous to put my hand up. My heart was beating, my hands were shaking. I was feeling all nervous and sweaty because I wasn't sure if I had the right answer. It was finding out for the first time when you deliver it to a class and say it to your teacher. That's when you find out if your answer is right or not. And sometimes I was told that it was incorrect. And so that doesn't really foster a positive learning environment. So what I discovered with reading these nominations is that students really value a judgment-free learning space. This goes back to that experiential style of learning. It is peer-to-peer focused, not teacher-to-peer focused. So by delivering them a generative AI scenario and giving them a good 15 to 20 minutes in tutorials to read the scenario, unpack it, discuss it with their peers, debate, research, engage in leadership. Like, I'm going to focus on this, you focus on that. They collaborate, they work together. They feel far more confident in asking me to come over to, see if I can answer a question for them compared to the teaching method that I was used to. And so for all of these reasons, it just fosters a really, really judgment-free, positive learning space. It's something that I really enjoy engaging in. And so, of course, so do my students. And that's why I really do encourage this style of collaborative learning. So hopefully I've now convinced you of all of the benefits of scaling up simulated learning in your classrooms. And hopefully you can see that generative AI offers the benefits of this delivery method, but without all of the time-consuming downsides of having to sit at a computer for an hour and try to generate these scenarios for yourself. So in the last 10 minutes, I'm just going to walk through some of the examples to hopefully inspire you all with the different ways that you can deliver these kind of simulated scenarios. And of course, then very happy to go to a bit of a question time. I can see lots of comments there that we can unpack in a moment. So first and foremost, of course, in the legal discipline, court trials are a very interesting environment to simulate. So this scenario was one I presented a few weeks ago in environmental law, and we were unpacking criminal law. So we have this evil corporation that is polluting, toxic waste into this community. We have the authority in this space, which is the Environmental Protection Authority. And this was produced through ChatGPT. You can see that some really vivid examples are given of the culture of the community, their reaction to this evergreen industries. It included a really interesting account of something that actually happened outside the local pub, a little bit of an altercation. And so what it allowed for was this really interesting nuance to the application of the law that week, which is, can you actually pin the criminal culpability of these acts on the company or the CEO itself? So how this scenario was generated was I went onto ChatGPT, I explained the legislation that was relevant for that week, the type of crime that I wanted students to unpack, and then it gave me this wonderful response. So once students were allocated their roles, you can see 3 groups were representing the evil corporation, and then I had 2 groups representing the authority. They were basically asked to represent the case to the court. So we started off with hearing evergreen industries try to argue their way out of criminal culpability, argue their way out of potential corporate fines, and hopefully keep the corporate veil over James Carter for his altercations at the pub. So that was really fascinating because, of course, my students felt like Evergreen Industries was probably in the wrong. But of course, in the real world, lawyers have to represent people with very weak cases as well as people with very good cases. So it put them in a position of developing skills that are critical for those that decide to become legal practitioners. And then, of course, once we heard the submissions for the evergreen industries, we then moved to the EPA, where they presented their case, which was the complete opposite. So what this allows in a classroom setting is every single table listening to each other, because you're actually simulating the court trial. So I was acting as the judge, wanting to hear the submissions from Evergreen Industries before moving to the EPA. And then you have Group 5 wanting to rebut a comment that Group 2 made. And so it facilitates this really interesting class dynamic that is incredibly engaging and means that even though I'm delivering the same tutorial 5 times that day, every class is different, and every tutorial brought up different points that were really pressing and interesting. So it makes it more fun for me. It's a very selfish reason as to why I teach in this way. It means all of my classes are unique and wonderful. Secondly, I have the simulated UN summit, which I delivered in week 2 of this semester. We were understanding international environmental law. And so I wanted to bring in a really pressing topic at the moment, which is deep sea mining. I explained that some countries have supported a moratorium on deep sea mining. I explained the science behind deep sea mining and why it should potentially invoke the precautionary principle, which was the key legal principle for that week. And then once again, I asked ChatGPT to allocate different roles to each table. This one was very interesting because, of course, students have to act as diplomats, which meant that in this form of diplomacy, they're potentially representing interests that they don't believe in, but they're representing that country that they were allocated. So each group represented a different country. I wanted a really nice mix of developed countries, developing countries, so that there was a more realistic array of stances on deep sea mining. Something extra that I did that week was that I also asked ChatGPT to give me one confidential fact about each of those countries that was really, really fascinating and just added a lot more kind of juiciness and depth to the scenario. Of course, in diplomacy, you don't always put forward all of the information you have on your country. And so while students were researching, say, Australia's stance on deep sea mining or Brazil's stance on deep sea mining, I went around to each table and gave them their little confidential fact, instructed them to decide whether they wanted to present that information to the summit or keep it confidential and just have it inform their stance. Students loved this week, especially when representing large powerhouses like the United States, because they understood that the United States does not engage in a lot of UN diplomacy, especially when it comes to environmentalism. So once again, they were understanding course content, but I wasn't asking them, to simply answer questions. They were applying that knowledge and therefore taking on the role of representing the United States. So that was a really, really fun week. Students really enjoyed debating that one. The third example here is a simulated court submission. In some cases, you might already have some sort of outcome to a scenario, whether it's a certain precedent in law school or a principle of business or some sort of understanding in a humanities subject. Here, it was the Gloucester case. That was the key case that I wanted students to understand. But I decided to bring students back to a time before that case was determined, so that they were basically encouraged to look up this case, read the court submissions whilst it was being deliberated in the Land and Environment Court, so that they could then understand the submissions and act on behalf of the clients. So this one I actually asked Copilot to do. I find that Copilot, if you do have access to it through your institutions, is very, very good at research. So ChatGPT has the benefit of providing very entertaining, eloquent language. It is very good at simulating scenarios that feel very tangible, interesting, maybe a little bit cheeky, certainly very engaging for students. But because this one was a little bit more technically nuanced, I decided to use Copilot. I presented the citation for the case, being the Gloucester case, and I asked it to basically explain the context of this case before a verdict was determined. There were a whole host of important kind of community values and principles that were relevant for this case. So it allowed for a really in-depth discussion due to the fact that I was able to allocate each table a very, very disparate role. So we had one group focused on Indigenous heritage values, another focused on biodiversity, which wasn't a huge strength of the case. And that's what I wanted them to unpack, critique, and therefore bring to the simulated scenario. Another was climate change, which was very prominent in that case, as well as the public interest, and then invoking the precautionary principle. So the wonderful thing about each group being allocated different roles is that they're actually wanting to listen to each other by the time you get to the simulation, because they've only looked at the Gloucester case through their lens of, say, Indigenous heritage or climate change. But I'm simulating court submissions where they're all collaborating, presenting different findings. And so students are actually really engaged for the entire tutorial because they're interested to hear what other students came up with and what other submissions were being presented to the Land and Environment Court, where I was the judge, which is a very fun role for me to take on. The fourth and final example was one that I presented just yesterday, and that is a simulated license approval. This one is a lot of fun because you have the authority, which in this case is the EPA again, either being convinced by groups 1, 2, and 3 submissions or their application to the EPA, or not being convinced and rejecting their license. So the stakes were very high, and groups 1, 2, and 3 really took on their roles quite seriously to convince groups 4 and 5 that they should be given their license. So whilst the scenario was quite straightforward, I put this one through ChatGPT to provide me with some facts and details that would just help to, once again, add a little bit more intrigue to this scenario. So without any sort of prompts, except for the POEO Act and the provision of the EPL process, It came out with interesting facts regarding like nearby farmland, the fact that there was a primary school. So the proposed works, which was a waste management company, were quite high risk. But they also, I asked ChatGPT to balance that with some things that were on the side of Clean Soil Proprietary Limited. And students immediately understood both the pros and cons to their application, found the relevant sections of the legislation to argue their application before the EPA assessors heard all of the applications being made that morning and determined whether to approve or reject the license. Sometimes groups 4 and 5 disagreed. That also allowed for a really fruitful discussion. And of course, I emphasize to students that these scenarios are developed in a way that means there isn't a clear answer. The law is nuanced and complicated. And so what I want students to focus on is that skills development, really taking on the role that I provide them with, and understanding course content. Whoop, lights went off. That's because clearly I need more dancing in my presentation this morning. Yeah, and so that's why, yeah, these scenarios don't have a clear answer. So it really allows for fruitful discussion. And so on that note, I would like to end with a very, very dark image. I started this presentation with a dark image, and I'm also going to end with one. And that is the calculator. When I first presented my pedagogy and encouraged academics at a teachers' conference back in 2023 to integrate generative AI into the classroom, there was a lot of hesitancy. Of course, there's a lot of ethical concerns, there's a lot of risk management, but hopefully what I've presented today convinces you that this form of integrating AI into your classrooms is very low risk, very sensitive in terms of time. It doesn't take a lot of time to actually, and in fact, it saves you time in developing your learning materials. And so whilst back in the 60s, we had maths teachers on the streets protesting the use of the calculator, worried that it was going to completely degrade students' ability to do maths in their head. I argue that AI is simply the latest version of that. And so we have to remember that machines are tools. They can be used for bad reasons, but I do encourage academics to find all of the opportunities that can be really cultivated for developing and delivering your tutorials. So thank you all very much for this breakfast session. I really, really hope you enjoyed spending your breakfast with me. And yeah, really keen to hear any questions that I could potentially answer. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Georgia. That was fascinating. I can see why your students are so appreciative of your work, and you're getting a huge round of applause from everybody. So thanks, everyone. So yes, we do have a few questions. If you've asked a question, I'll ask you to actually ask Georgia directly. So we'll just go through them and get through as many as we can. So the first one's from Rose Vergara. I can see you there, Rose. So would you like to ask Georgia your question?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Georgia. Really interesting presentation. I guess I'm curious. I'm in a health field, so I'm a physiotherapy lecturer, and I guess our course is a little bit different in that obviously we've got like health related content and we need to check safety and effectiveness, but also mindful of how can we and we do use a lot of clinical scenarios that we get students to work through. But any thoughts on how you might translate that to the health sciences, health sector? And then what does that mean for authenticity, that kind of thing? Just thinking like not wanting students to be able to kind of go into chat and get the answers, that's where I was thinking. Yeah.
Absolutely, Rosa. Thank you for that question. Can I clarify whether you deliver tutorials in like an hour-long class setting where they're sitting down, access to their computers, that kind of thing?
Yes. Yeah. So we typically have like a lecture that comes up with content, then there may or may not be a tutorial, and depending on which course it is. And then there's always a practical that basically follows along. So sometimes tutorial-like content is delivered in a practical, or if you don't have that tute, or it's done like a lecture tute and prac.
Great. Yep, got it. Yeah, I also did a Bachelor of Science, so I know that kind of more prac style of delivery. So really, this style of simulated learning is something that I encourage in any classroom setting where you're engaging in a discussion of course content. Similarly to your discipline, the law has a lot of ethical implications about how to be a good lawyer, how to represent your client, how to ensure that your first duty is to the court. And so I actually specifically asked, say, ChatGPT or Copilot to simulate scenarios where I am encouraging them to take on roles of ethical professionals. So if like a kind of suggestion would be to start with the kind of model professional that you're trying to instill in them, and then ask ChatGPT to create a simple scenario that allows them to take on that role. So if there is some sort of health or ethical implication that is really important for them to understand and hopefully embrace and model, that can actually be the learning outcome of that scenario. So yes, I totally get that. Similar with the law, you're having to navigate very nuanced, difficult topics. But I argue that if you're asking students to take on that role and personify it, that's far more effective of a learning outcome than simply discussing it in class, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rosa.
Thank you, Rosa. Okay, the next question is from T.R. Muir. Are you there?
Yes,
T.R.
thank you,
Muir? Hi.
Tracy. Yeah, Tracy's
Hi,
my
Tracy.
name.
Sorry,
Thank you.
your name didn't come up with it. Thanks.
True, yeah. Thank you, Georgia. That was very engaging. So I teach in the School of Education and we have a multi-mode delivery. So we have some classes on campus, we have some classes online scheduled, and we have some classes online unscheduled. So my question to you is, like, how do you see this approach working in an online environment where many of our students study in an asynchronous mode of online delivery, where they work through the course materials at their own pace, and typically their, I guess, involvement or evidence of learning is through posts on a discussion board, which they might or might not do. So do you have any suggestions, I guess, for how this could be translatable or aspects of this could be translatable into online? Because I see lots of it'd be quite easily to adapt, particularly we're talking with training teachers in a on-campus environment.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, great question. So my teaching practice is both online tutorials and face-to-face tutorials. It's not asynchronous, so all of my students are either in a Zoom meeting where I'm able to put them into breakout rooms or in a face-to-face environment where they're already sitting on tables where they can collaborate. So there is very easy transferability from a face-to-face tutorial with my PowerPoint slide that has my simulated scenario on it, instructs the students on what each table is going to be allocated in terms of their roles. That's very easy to then put onto my Zoom meetings with the same PowerPoint slide, and I simply put them in breakout rooms. Of course, a lot of the benefits that I've spoken to today are the kind of collaborative peer-to-peer learning that happens in this judgment-free environment of a classroom setting. But I have had units where there are forums each week and students are expected, but I agree, Tracy, sometimes don't always actually do it, that provide some sort of reply or response to show that they engaged with that. In the past, I found that those more online forum methods were similar to face-to-face tutorials where it was simple question and answer, Socratic question and answer. So what I would encourage is taking that simulated scenario and having that be the topic of conversation on the online forum. Hopefully that will allow for a lot more diversity in opinion and in the answers. And perhaps you could even say, here are the 5 different roles that you're able to take on. Maybe there could be different pedagogy types for the kind of teacher that they're wanting to be, just to allow for some more fruitful discussion and hopefully really interesting answers. So that would, be my suggestion.
Thank you, Georgia. I appreciate that.
Thanks, Tracy. And there's a question from Makola. Are you there, Makola? Possibly not. A few people have left. There was just a question, how does this relate to assessment, Georgia?
So I would
Yes.
definitely defer to my colleague, Dr. Amanda Head, on her work that she's doing at the moment in assessment. Um, I don't operate in that realm because I'm not a convener. So I don't have to deliver assessments. And I would say that the ways in which she's integrating AI into assessments is a very, very different methodology. Um, Simply because the problem is that students are producing, say, an essay that is completely generated by AI. So her research is focused on either engaging in like annotation tools or softwares where you can't simply produce a 2,500 word essay in a Word document. There's also a lot more like video submissions where students have to actually engage in oral communication and practice those skills. So there's a lot of innovation happening in that space. But I focus my attention simply on tutorial delivery, simply because I think they pose different challenges and different solutions.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I didn't realize you were there. I jumped in. Okay, the next question is from Ellen. Are you there, Ellen?
Yeah, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it was just you mentioned the four kind of restraints of the white walls in the classroom. I'm really curious about your active learning ideal space. Like, what would it look like to kind of cultivate the practices you're doing around simulated learning?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Ellen. So, with the model that I briefly introduced that I'm working on with Dr. Amanda Head and Dr. Brian Bolson Stanton, is a classroom in which every single student has their own computer and is actually engaging with an AI platform. This style of learning has proven to be incredibly successful at student engagement simply because it is a personalized learning experience. So essentially, each student has their laptop. We've coded the AI platform to take on, say, a client or a judge or a police officer. And we've given it a scenario and certain parameters to basically personify this person. Then students are actually on their computer, introducing them to their law firm and asking them questions if, say, it's a client interview. And that is highly engaging. And students have just been surveyed to show that they absolutely love it. So I do see that being the future of AI integration in the classroom. It definitely solves that 30 to 1 conundrum of it's very difficult to engage 30 students when there's one teacher. That's the two sigma problem by Bloom. And so I think that solves it beautifully. So that's where a lot of my attention is being focused. But as I said, it's a very time-consuming form of teaching delivery, and the technology is evolving, and it requires a lot of expertise to understand how to code these platforms, which is where I defer to Brian. So what I presented today is a more kind of simplified version that doesn't transform the classroom or require a lot of resources and expenditure. It's still that kind of traditional teacher-student classroom, but hopefully with scenarios that intellectually transport students to real world contexts. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you. Next question. So there's a few questions this morning, Georgia.
No, please.
So Joanne White, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi.
My question was just around, you mentioned early in your presentation, Georgia, about that idea of us sort of being able to control what's in the workshop or tutorial space and think about how we make the most of that, sort of regardless of what students are doing around that with things like lectures and readings. I'm imagining, though, that your workshops, which sound really, really engaging, would be quite difficult, though, for a student that turns up having done none of the pre-class reading or lectures. So I'd imagine that these scenarios, while really engaging, would still be quite difficult if there's no base knowledge. So how do you manage that in that non-judgmental sort of way? So encouraging students to come, but how do they engage if they don't have any of the base knowledge required?
Yeah, absolutely, Joanne. Yes, and that is the pool of students that I'm really wanting to focus my attention on. So, uh, essentially, when I deliver these tutorials, I start from the assumption that students haven't looked at anything that week in terms of course content, haven't looked at the lectures, haven't done the readings, turning up with fresh brains that are hopefully switched on and caffeinated, but sometimes even that is too much to ask. So I start off by introducing a few of the key concepts. So in the examples that I gave, I'm really just focusing on one or two legal principles or cases that I want students to intimately understand by the end of the tutorial. So I start off with hopefully an achievable learning objective. I introduce those concepts myself at the start of the tutorial in the first 5 minutes. I then situate them in the real world context. So for deep sea mining, I'm not assuming that students have any knowledge on it. And so I explain the precautionary principle. I explain how countries are potentially invoking it in this deep sea mining context. We need to be precautionary because it's a new technology. It has consequences that we're not aware of yet. So I explain that to students. I kind of show them a picture of what deep sea mining looks like just to bring it into the real world. And then I allocate a really good 15 or 20 minutes for students to read the scenario, understand what their role is, and then engage in research, look up online, read news articles, speak to peers. In that way, they don't have to assume to have any knowledge. They're finding the answers in the tutorials. But what they're doing without hopefully really even realizing it is invoking the legal concepts that I taught them at the start. And it happens quite naturally when you place them in this simulated role-based scenario, because they think for that group of students, oh, I didn't need to have any assumed knowledge. We're researching and finding the answer together, and we're debating, and I found this news article and this person found that news article. So it's very collaborative, and students do report that it feels very judgment free, which is a benefit that I never really considered when I first started delivering tutorials like this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you very much. Now we've run out of time, but we'll just have one last question if that's okay. And I'd just like to apologize for anyone else who's asked questions. I'm sure Georgia won't mind if you get in touch with her. Is that okay, Georgia?
Absolutely. Yeah, my email's on that screen. Happy to
Fabulous.
chat.
So there's one last question from Sharon Coots.
Good morning,
Can you hear
Georgia.
Sharon?
How are you?
Good morning, Sharon. Thank you so much for attending today.
And thank you for sharing. It's been really interesting listening to what you're doing and how you're doing. So I know this is not, you're not focused on assessment with this presentation, but I'm just wondering if you can briefly tell us, are there connections to assessment? You've talked a lot about a non-judgmental environment, but you've really foregrounded the collaboration, the communication. They're really important professional skills for your students to have. And so are your activities linked in any way to assessment in the subject? Are you preparing them, for example, for a Viva assessment? Are there any connections?
Yes, absolutely, Sharon. So I can only really speak to my legal discipline for this answer because I haven't researched beyond that. So I will just answer from that perspective. We are having a huge emphasis on professional skills. We have the legal admission board that ensures that our degree has professional outcomes. We're held to a very high standard in that regard to produce ethical, sound, rational, informed lawyers. So it is that really strong focus on skills acquisition that I thought was really missing from tutorials when I first started teaching. And that is one of the largest benefits that I advocate for with these simulated scenarios. It's the fact that I am observing students adopt these professional skills and cultivate these professional skills. So in terms of assessment design, in every single unit that I teach, 15 to 20% of their final grade is allocated to participation in tutorials, attendance in tutorials, professional skills in those tutorials. So I have always been marking their attendance, their contributions, and how they engage in tutorials. And it was on that basis that I was seeing this huge gap between attending and meaningful participation. And we're told as tutors, don't mark attendance, mark meaningful participation. And so that challenge really arose for me to say, well, how do I get them to not merely turn up, but actually engage? And so this style of judgment-free collaborative learning allows me to observe all of the students in the room, even the quiet ones, who are hopefully engaging in some level of discussion in their groups, if not, presenting to the class at the end of the lesson.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon.
Okay, that's it, folks. Thank you so much for being there this morning. And again, apologies to those who've got a question and didn't have a chance to ask them. But obviously, George is much in demand, and her questions, she generated a lot of questions. It was fabulous. And thank you so much, Georgia Cam from Macquarie University. I can see why you've got a very well-deserved AAUT citation. So we really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for spending time with us. And yeah, it was fantastic. And hopefully we'll get you again sometime when you're the dean or
Absolutely.
something. Or
More than happy, Stuart. It was an
yeah.
absolute pleasure to
So
spend.
thank you so much for that. For everyone here, that I'll send out the recording to this session the next day or so. And Georgie, you may get an email or two. So
Please,
stand by for
welcome.
that. And thank you again for being there, and have a fantastic day of teaching ahead.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.